Tangible Hope Podcast, Episode 4. My name is Willie Elliott, and I am a professor at the University of Michigan. And my co-host is Melinda Lewis, a professor of practice at the University of Kansas. Maybe you did not know, but our Canadian neighbors have a successful national children's savings account program called Canada's Education Savings Plan. Today, we are fortunate enough to have as our guest Christina Norris, Director General of Canada's Education Savings Program. She works in the Canadian government's Learning Branch, Employment and Social Development. If you find this episode informative and want to be sure others hear it, please hit the like button and subscribe. It only takes a second and helps others find this podcast. Also, you can find links to previous episodes and related materials in the description or show notes. Christina, maybe you can start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and Canada's Education Savings Program.
Super. Thanks, Willie. Thanks so much for the invitation from you and Melinda to invite me this morning to be on your show. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm a public service executive working in the space of Canada Education Savings Program. In terms of my personal history, have worked for the public service in a variety of roles over the past 25 years or so, and it's been a lovely experience. In terms of our conversation this morning on education savings, I'd like to just start off by acknowledging that I'm joining you from where I work and I live in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, which sits on traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And in Canada, we are taking land acknowledgement as one of many important steps in our efforts on the path toward reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. So I want to start there. In terms of the Canadian system, so many differences, some similarities to what's happening in the United States. But just as a quick memory jogger, vast geography, small population, population that's just hitting 40 million Canadians. Most of us live very close to our American neighbors along the border. Bilingual country, English and French. We're a country of immigrants. 500,000 newcomers were welcomed into Canada last year. So a significant part of our population comes from immigrant sources. Education in Canada is largely a provincial jurisdiction. So our 13 provincial and territorial jurisdictions have the important role to make education-related decisions. At the federal level, we also do quite a bit in this space, and often in partnership with provinces. We do a fair bit of granting councils, research funding, significant transfers to provinces to support students, but we also do direct student support through a robust system of loans and grants and student financial assistance, and then pivoting to our topic today as well in education savings. Education savings, I think, are closely linked to your 529 program in the US. So education savings programs are largely delivered through a tax-free savings account called a registered education savings plans. These plans have been around in Canada since the 70s, working fairly well. What we noticed in government in the late 90s is that families who were using this tax-free savings account were higher income families, and that the government decided they want to try and incent Canadians. The late 90s was a time of asset-based building in Canada, really leaning into that approach. And so the government developed a program where the federal government would deliver a benefit, a 20% additional grant on any dollar that families saved for their children's education. So a pretty generous grant, and there's a lifetime maximum of $7,200. So for every child, there could be a federal grant of $7,200 per child. What happened, just moving along the timeline a little bit, is that in the early years of this program, it was a universal program. It was recognized that it continued to be the case that higher income families were taking advantage of this program, and the government wanted to make the initiative more progressive. So to do that, the government did two things at the time. First, what we did is develop income-tested grants so that children and families who had experienced low or modest income would receive an additional 20 or 10% on the savings they set aside for their children. So quite a generous top up based on income profile.
Why 20 or 10%?
Just to make the incentive more generous for the most generous for low income people, so an extra 20% on the previous 20%, and then to recognize modest level income still needed a little bit of a step up. So that's the 10% value. And in addition, recognition that those children who are experiencing low income may not have parents who can set aside any money at all for their children's education. And so at that time in 2004, we created what's called the Canada Learning Bond. And that is up to a $2,000 grant that is deposited into an RESP of a child who's experienced low income without parents or grandparents having to save even a dollar. So that's an exciting program. That program now is reaching its 20th anniversary, and the Canada Education Savings Programs, the larger grants, are reaching our 25th anniversary. So this year, speaking with you, it's a lovely, we're celebrating a couple of birthdays this year.
Thank you so much for that context, Christina. And the way it helps people, I think, understand the way that nesting structures and are helping families to approach education savings, and how policy levers have been used to make an inherently relatively regressive structure a progressive one. So certainly a lot of lessons there for us to think about, in Canada and also in the United States. When I was reading some of the materials that you shared in preparation for our conversation, I was particularly struck that there's evidence that the CESP is not only helping students get to post-secondary education, but increasing completion. So I want you to talk a little bit about how you are thinking about the education savings policies as not just increasing access, but facilitating completion. And then if there's anything that struck you as particularly, important to focus on in celebrating these, birthdays and anniversaries, I'd love to hear what, leaps out at you. What are you looking at in terms of those indicators? But can you tell us about completion and, what we know about why that matters, and how you're trying to increase success on that front?
Hey, Christina, my role in
Yeah,
this is just to interrupt occasionally and
of
make
course.
comments. So I'm going to
Please.
interrupt here and just simply put a little context to that for the kind of the U.S. audience. A lot of our programs, our children's savings account programs, which you oftentimes use the 529 system platforms, so similar to your program, are still relatively in their infancy. We started, a lot later than you in this asset building endeavor. And so we're just getting to the point of having some kids in some of our earliest programs enter college age. And so we don't actually have results yet on programs with kids in college. And so these findings are very exciting and important to us. And there are very few that exist around the world. Italy has done some work, but theirs wasn't a national program, and it wasn't a program that started early on, but started later. So you should be particularly excited about these findings. In you're once again leading your neighbor in this effort. So we appreciate it.
Right. That's why we
Oh.
want to know, how do you do it? Because that is, so much what we're hoping we will see in different asset building programs. And you're actually demonstrating that you're moving that most crucial needle.
Oh,
Absolutely.
one more thing. One
Yeah,
more
of
thing.
course.
That's fun. And then we'll let you get to the important answer. Is I actually did some of the original work in the US using secondary data. And so it was around kids who designated savings for college. And we found some robust results with regard to both college enrollment and college completion. And one more quickly, and understanding all of this for our audience is that these programs can start as early as birth or some in kindergarten. And so, and the main goal was to increase college enrollment and college completion, which is so far off, right? In some ways, right? But yet so close. And the fact that, like, we had this early evidence around the secondary data that was fairly robust. There's people right now in the US are biting their chops at finding out whether or not this actually plays out. So do tell.
Well, thank you for all of that context. It is lovely to be at a state where we have program maturity of 25 years because we can start now thinking about the impact of education savings, not only on, as you mentioned, enrollment, but on completion. And we're just starting to look at early labor market outcomes as well. So it is an exciting time to
Oh,
have this data set in Canada. I think some important context for the Canadian situation is that we are a country internationally that's recognized as having a high percentage of our population having a tertiary education credential. So over 70%, I think we're at about 73% of our adult population has a college or university credential. So that's quite high in the international context. And in fact, some of that largely we think is driven to a very good and strong college level system. I think in our university level system, we don't have the same capacity as our American neighbors, but a very strong college system. And a country based on immigration, where our human capital approach to immigration means that immigrants coming to Canada are already highly educated and value education as a pathway to success for their children. But we have some exciting data. We conducted a formal program evaluation last year that did show that we have 63% of 18-year-olds who received education savings money were enrolled in post-secondary education by the time they were 26. That's compared to 33% of 18-year-olds who did not receive that funding. So that's powerful on the enrollment side. Melinda, you were asking about completion. Of course, enrollment matters. Completion matters most in terms of labor market outcomes. But we do have also some exciting data showing that the probability of graduating from a post-secondary education institution was 7 percentage points higher for individuals who had received education savings compared to those who hadn't. And the most exciting finding is all of this in our efforts to think about inclusion of those who experienced low income is that we found an important independent difference on education savings for low and modest income children. So that asset mattered more to them, even when controlling for other factors, than it did to middle and higher income families. So those are some really exciting results.
let me say something on that note. That is something we have found consistently within our research, both in the secondary data analysis and in our primary analysis, not only with regard to college enrollment and college completion, but early education outcomes and expectations in these things have been stronger for the low income families. These programs benefit them more. And in a social policy context where it's very hard to find programs that actually benefit low income families. I mean, this is something really to be proud of, and that is really important, and why we are pushing so hard for these programs. It's not just because it's our research, but because it has the real potential helping low income people. So it is really exciting findings.
Absolutely.
No, and so I mean, one of the things then I think that we all, agree is that because there is so much potential for these assets to be transformative, especially in the lives of those who have been disadvantaged, we got to find ways to connect folks to the asset building mechanisms. And so on this front, I noticed that in the Ontario experiment, and certainly thinking about the extent to which you can learn from what's happening in the provinces and partner, that there's a federal and provincial partnership to some extent in these efforts. The effort in Ontario to tie RESP like initiation to the newborn registration, the kind of birth registration process. And that parallels, not to always think everything's got to parallel the United States. It matters what's happening in Canada for its own right, on its own right. But, that, mirrors what we've seen in states like Rhode Island that tied starting a 529 to the birth certificate process, and states that have tried to simplify that process. So I'm interested in how you're looking at the federal level at those results in Ontario, and just really what you're thinking about as ways to create systems that connect families to these accounts and to these asset building opportunities, precisely because what can happen for their students if they do.
I'm going to test your memory, Christina,
Okay.
because I'm going to interject before you answer that question one more time to provide a little more context. And so I think you know Michael Sheridan. He's kind of like the
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
godfather of asset
mm-hmm,
building for
mm-hmm.
those who don't know him. I was on an email exchange with him yesterday, and I was telling him that you were coming to speak on it. And this is one of the primary questions of interest to him. So your answer is not only to our audience, but also specifically to Michael. So no pressure.
Okay, excellent. So I'm happy to talk about the work that we're doing with Ontario. We also deliver another provincial program that I can speak a little bit about. What happened with our colleagues in Ontario was really exciting. Our federal budget in 2017 made an announcement that we wanted to make registration for certain benefits more accessible for parents in Ontario, so our largest province. Who had newborns. And so what we did is called a birth bundle initiative. So we have a 5-in-1 birth bundle initiatives in Ontario where parents can, through an Ontario government website, register their child's birth, request a birth certificate, apply for federal benefits. So the Canada Child Benefit is a really important anti-poverty measure in Canada, though it also has a universal aspect. So all children are included. Um, and those families can also request an education savings referral. And what that means is families who tick on that option in their 5-in-1 birth bundle will have a financial institution of their choice. We have a list of about a dozen who will make a contact with them within a 2-week period of receiving that referral to start the process of opening an RESP. So we were really excited about that partnership. We'd love to leverage that to do the same process with other provinces. One of the things we find, if I were to be, as is my job, critical and aim to do better, is that it still is the case that parents who receive that referral need to undergo a number of steps to open a registered education savings plan. And so the impact on take up that we had hoped to see in Ontario hasn't quite materialized. I'm still proud of this work from a service delivery perspective. It makes good sense, but I think we need to do more to make the enrollment process in RESPs more automatic, easier. And this is where Willie has challenged and encouraged me on many occasions.
Yeah, and I want to get into that a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have found in the research here, and if Michael were here, he would strongly press this upon you, is that in the end, the amount of effort and time that it takes to try to enroll families, automatic enrollment is the only way to have full access. I mean, this is something that CSD, Center for Social Development, that Michael Sheridan runs. They have found just strong evidence that automatic enrollment is the way to do a kind of a national program that's going to be all inclusive. And so all we can do and hope that people in your government will take time to watch this podcast and think about how they might actually get to automatic enrollment, particularly given the strong findings you're having with regard to its impact on low income families. Even if you only automatically enroll low income families, it'd be a step forward that we would suggest all families. But so so hopefully this will be something that you can leverage and use moving forward. And certainly, I'm sure Michael would be glad to come and talk to the people within the government, and I would also to the kind of benefits of that. Not that we've accomplished that in the U.S. yet on a national stage. Some of our states have done that, but and this does tie into a conversation we had that will come an episode prior to this episode with Ray Boschero from Senator Casey's office. He's a fellow there, and he's introducing Senator Casey's introducing a national legislation in the U.S. that very much mirrors, interestingly enough, kind of how you've are putting more assets into the accounts for these kids, whether it's the 20% of the 2,000 additional, all that different funding, right? And the initial $7,200 that you're providing as a government to the kids, this is far more than what we have done in our state-run programs. And this is kind of what maybe Senator Casey's bill is trying to get towards, is putting these much more robust amounts of money into the accounts. So once again, kudos to you. At the same time, you need to look at that automatic enrollment to really make this all that you want it to be.
Totally fair. Thank you.
Christina, in the management response, and that is among my favorite like innovations in how government works. I just thought, like, here's research, here's evaluation that is conducted, and we have to respond to those findings and those recommendations. So as an instructor of policy and somebody who's cares about what policies say, I just, like, that made my heart sing. One of the things that was highlighted there was different outreach efforts, because to Willie's point, and I see you nodding your head, so automatic enrollment gets folks in, and the closer you can get to that, then the more you don't put the kind of burden of the initiation of those accounts on families and on kids. But that's not the only thing that matters. There are also ways that you can encourage a savings orientation among those who are going to be influenced by some of the behaviors and the experiences that they could catalyze for their kids. So I'm interested in what I didn't see in the outline, and particularly ways that you might use media, social media, kind of grassroots efforts to create energy and momentum. Not that substitutes for automatically, or again, as close to automatically as possible, getting folks in the accounts, but just thinking about anything that you are changing or hoping to change, or ways that you could leverage other efforts to build an excitement in the culture of saving for tertiary education.
Absolutely. So great question. Just, Melinda, reflecting back on your feedback about our manager's response, I agree with you. Being in the public policy delivery world, the transparency about our management responses and our formal evaluation, both are which in the public domain. We were also subject to a formal Auditor General's report in Canada about a year ago on a number of benefits and our effectiveness or not, including on the Canada Learning Bond. And we received important feedback from the Auditor General on that. And that report is also public, and our response is public. And we have an obligation to go back to Parliament from time to time to report on our progress. So I too appreciate that as a citizen and as a public policy deliverer of programs. For our communications, we do spend time. We have a pretty robust social media outwork. I'd say that one of the things that's a challenge in Canada, it may be true in the US, is particularly for young people themselves and youth themselves, a sense of trust in government and interest in engaging with our government tools and resources. We're not always the best as bureaucrats to communicate with young people directly. We do have some partnerships that help us get at some of that information indirectly. So we have spent over the past 4 years funding a range of community-based organizations from coast to coast to coast to do outreach and awareness taking on the Canada Learning Bond, in particular, education savings more broadly. We have particular interest in particular subpopulations. We know that, for example, Indigenous children are less likely to be enrolled in our program. So working really hard with Indigenous communities and Indigenous financial institutions, importantly, so Indigenous-led credit unions, to help in certain First Nations go on reserve, conduct enrollment events, along with delivering other federal benefits. So we're working hard in that space. We also know that in Canada, we have a large percentage of children in care who are not receiving education savings benefits, and being a child in care automatically provides youth eligibility to our program. And so that's some of the effort and outreach work we're doing with our community-based organizations. We bring that network together, those organizations we fund, plus others who are partners in the space for all of the good social policy outcome reasons that they might have, and have a network of actually over 300 community-based partners that meet on about a quarterly basis. It used to be through teleconference. Now we can do video-based engagement sessions where organizations share best practices about what worked in their communities, whether it's newcomers, Indigenous, or other vulnerable populations. The issue of financial literacy is one that we are increasingly thinking about inside government, and how to do a better job of translating what is a very complex ecosystem of financial supports for families, and finding a way to ensure children and their parents are more aware of our programs. So progress made, but a lot more to be done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that does, Willie, I think, make me think some about what we heard from Ray about how in the United States, the proposal for that legislation would be a federal structure with an individual, or excuse me, like states and communities being able to layer onto that. So, again, kind of this nesting. Willie, I'm interested in both of you talking a little bit about the outcomes in Canada's evaluation about CESP reducing not only the likelihood of student debt, but the amount of student debt. That being I was glad to see that in the evaluation, because too often I think we look at student debt as a binary, like, if either you are having to borrow, even though you built assets, or you're not. But this highlighted the reduction in the amount of student debt as a something to be celebrated, which makes me think about also, Willie, your research and some of, which I got to contribute to some, of finding that people who don't have as much student debt when they finish college then are better positioned to do other asset building. So it just struck me as like a celebration that, like, yes, it is a good thing if someone is if they still have to borrow, but they are having to borrow less. That's good for what their future prospects might be. So I just would like to have some discussion about the how we could think about the potential of asset building programs and policies in either country as reducing the amount of student borrowing, and kind of what it would take for that to be an outcome that families could achieve through participating.
Yeah, I guess I'll start it off. First, I'll direct this to the new report we at the center have put out on the return on degree, which talks in some ways about how to reduce debt, and how CSAs can be a part of that. And I will say, Melinda, that I don't know if it's a celebration or we should just be plain out mad at Christina, because every time we have these results, whether they are kids are more likely to go to college or graduate to college using secondary data, she goes and uses primary data and does it better. And now with regard to the with regard to the reducing debt, which was a paper you and I wrote, is now she's trumping that again. So we can either look at it that way. That's a cup half full, or we can half empty, I guess. Or we can look at it as a half full one and say she's validating our research findings from before, which is how I look at it, to be honest. It's great to see that the things that we hypothesized on and tested with secondary data and proxies are now showing out in the data. I think in a U.S. context, and I'm sure in Canada too, because I noticed that recently, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Christina, Canada adopted a program of zero interest on student loans. This, I think, is something that the U.S. should go to, because we find that debt actually rises over time among college graduates rather than being reduced. And so it is really important, and that highlights both the importance of the findings, is that kids who have less debt when they leave college are going to have better outcomes long term. And beyond just the finding that CSAs or children's savings accounts or reduce debt the kids have, it also is important to understand that having debt reduces their labor market outcomes, reduces their return on degree in the long run, reduces the amount of wealth they can accumulate. That's why it's important that the debt is reduced, is because of the negative outcomes that it produces on our kids' futures. Lastly, and I'll let you talk, is that this, when you brought up the fact that you'll be having these findings on labor market outcomes soon, that also I think will be important, and take the report we just put out to another stage and provide data around that we don't clearly have as yet. Someone in a CSA program and how their labor market outcomes are better or worse, right, will be substantial to substantiating some of the hypotheses within that report. So we'll be anxiously looking forward to those outcomes, and hopefully we can do a blog or another podcast at some point or something to talk about that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, and thank you. And so for the research listening, we are very lucky in Canada. I feel like I get to brag because I started my career at Statistics Canada, but we have a really respected statistical agency that does house for us an incredibly rich set of linked data. So we have individual pathways, all kinds of socio-demographic characteristics through our census data linked with a wide range of administrative data. So for the researchers listening, we have education savings data, loan data, grant data, and then labor market pathways. So a longitudinal administrative database housed very carefully and closely, but linked longitudinal data. So it's really an exciting database that grows every year, and we're adding more data sets all the time.
And you can link the kids in the
Correct.
program to that.
Correct.
And that's in the US, we might have the other data, but we don't have data that allows us to link our kids in statewide CSA programs, whatever else, to that data. And so it is quite an advantage.
And because these programs are national, it's a little bit easier to do. In terms of the system, the sort of ecosystem of student financial assistance, it is true that whether there's debt matters, and Melinda, to your point, how much debt matters a lot. There are some differences that we may have in general principles with student financial assistance. We do have quite a robust system of grants and loans, and certainly the government invested in the context of the pandemic in really important ways for students. I know that happened in the US as well, and some of those measures have been reconfirmed in our most recent budgets. Having no interest on student loans is one of those measures. We do a number of things like offering students the ability to take the grants and not the loans. We do have populations of students who are debt averse or who aren't comfortable engaging in interest-based programs. So it's a pretty robust system. In terms of funding for that system, 60% of those dollars for student financial assistance for loans and grants come from the federal government, and 40% of those funds come from provincial governments. So in some provinces, we have an integrated federal provincial system of delivery of student financial assistance. And we do also have a pretty generous repayment plan so that student borrowers who start to enter the labor market or have a hard time entering the labor market and are struggling in repayment, we offer them some assistance and relief, either pausing their payment. There are various measures that can be applied. So all of those things I do think help to make that integration, which is the objective of our education system, into the labor market successful.
Yeah. No,
I would press on you in this, not surprisingly, because we wrote the report. So is to think about the report and just the negative effects, even some of the work that Melinda and I did very early on with regard to these, what I call treating the symptom of debt. And while I think it's a large step to eliminate interest, and one that I think I believe, and I don't really know, that our president could do on his own, because unfortunately we can't do anything as a Congress, and so it has to be done through presidential authority. I think it's something he should look at. But my point here is to say that in the end, it just really is treating a symptom, and that these students, even if they're allowed to pause, are going to suffer long-term outcomes from not being able to accumulate wealth, from where they think they're at, and all these other things. So the ultimate goal needs to be, how do we make a more robust system that kind of gets us towards not having debt at all when they leave college. But these are great steps and do show the effectiveness of the program.
Yeah, no, super exciting. So I think I only have probably time for one more question, and then we'll give you a chance, Christina, if there's anything that you want to add. But, in addition to this robust data set that you have access to, this most recent evaluation included also qualitative conversations with families about their experiences and the way that participating in CESP, that receiving the Canada Learning Bond, contributed to an identity, a college-bound identity, and really changed how they think. And that's the work that has animated so much of Willie's scholarship, and attracted the attention of policymakers in multiple countries. So I just wanted Willie, you to be able to chime in about what we know about how those identity effects and those expectations that parents talked about in this report in Canada, how those expectations catalyze outcomes for children. And then, Christina, what made you focus on that aspect as a complement to this rigorous quantitative data? And are there other things that you are going to be looking for, especially among older students and graduates, in terms of how participating in an RESP and CESP and the integrated system, how that's affecting how people think and feel about education?
Christina, I'm going to let you go first, only because I'm long-winded, so I want to make sure you get a chance to fully
Wonderful.
answer.
Well, Melinda, thank you for that comment. I think on this topic, this is where we're learning from you in the United States, on the on the important impact of aspirations and that college-bound identity. So this is why we've reached out to you folks and to Willie so many times. One of my favorite personal narratives about the impact of education savings comes from, I don't know if she knows I talk about her as much as I do, but we have our first Indigenous president of a university in Canada is Dr. Deborah Saunier, who is the president of the University of Vancouver Island on our west coast. And she speaks about the Canada Learning Bond wasn't in existence when her family was thinking about her education, but she speaks about growing up in a fairly vulnerable childhood education, and yet her parents made a decision to set aside a small amount of money for education savings. And so she became a first generation learner who not only completed a university undergraduate education, then went on to complete, these stories are not unfamiliar to you both, a PhD, and then became a president of a university. And so she speaks about education savings as having had an agenda of hope, giving young people an agenda of hope. So that is a story we try and tell everywhere we can, because it is so powerful. We were really pleased that we were able to reach out indirectly through partners and our community-based organizations to talk to families about their experience in engaging with the system. Lots of pain points for families because our delivery mechanism is through financial institutions. It does happen that there are some biases and prejudice in those institutions in working with vulnerable populations and welcoming them into opening a tax-free savings account and making investment decisions. So we are working hard on better engagement with financial community. We are working at hearing how the names of our programs even are complex to understand for families, understanding the difference of the pathways to onboard and how those monies could be used. So lots of information for us on better outreach, better information, simplifying our systems and processes and communication. All of those things matter a great deal. And as would be no surprise to you, the more vulnerable the population, the more we need to provide wraparound supports and services for those families. So that was just, our assumptions were confirmed through that exchange.
Just kind of piggybacking off of that, and it is interesting that using the term hope, and we have really started transitioning towards talking about tangible hope as a way of kind of conceptualizing and thinking about this, because it just seems easier for people to understand, relate to, grasp, and what assets do, what we have seen in these programs do is kind of, and we're actually writing a paper now that should be out in January around qualitative study in St. Paul and it looks at how families think about assets and how they talk about assets as something for the future, where income is very present oriented. It's about consumption. It's about what can I do now? How can I make it through the day? When they start talking about assets, it's about how can my kids' futures be better? And I want to, these kinds of things. And so, but a part of what CSAs do, children's savings accounts, is they help make that future feel more tangible to the families. It's not just a wishful, hopeful kind of thing. It's we have grounds for believing that this can come to pass. That I'm not just aspirational about going to college. I actually have money being put aside by the government, by my family, and by others that is preparing the stage for me to go. Right. And I thought one thing, and this is just on topic, off topic, that since I'm writing this paper, I was working on it today. I really started thinking about, like, when you give kids an asset, you're giving them. It's not that you're giving them something physical in nature necessarily. What you're giving them is rights, claims to the future that is backed by our legal system. It's backed by our constitutions, right? And so that's one of the reasons why assets provide such a tangibleness and an ability to touch and experience the future, because it's our faith in our institutions. And if you read somebody like DeSoto's work on capitalism and stuff, and he talks about how in some countries, unlike Canada or the US, the property rights aren't as established. And so it's not just a matter of giving them assets, but it's also the fact that, like, what gives it this tangibleness, what allows people to have so much faith in it, is the fact of the strength of our institutions, and that claim is now out in the future. And if we understand assets in that abstract way, not as I own a physical thing, we can begin to understand and see how it lets us touch and experience and lay claim to a future for our kids and for ourselves. And so, I don't know. These are things I'm exploring now and trying to put on paper more clearly. But I think you're seeing it on the ground and in the conversations of people in your program. And this is consistent. Like, of all the findings that CSAs have, they change the way people think about the future. Period. We can just stop right there with that. Not literally stop the podcast, but stop the.
Well, no, I'm thank you, Willie and Christina. I'm done asking questions, although I'm sure I could ask you tons more. But I just want to give you a chance to say anything that you think listeners need to hear about what you're doing and what questions you're asking in Canada as you continue to be, I think we consider, a leader globally in using established systems to facilitate transformative asset experiences, and to do so equitably and informed by evidence. So anything else that we need to hear about the wisdom that you are accumulating there in our neighbor to the north?
Thank you for that, Melinda. I think so. What I really appreciate about our various exchanges and dialogue is the ability to learn from each other. So I appreciate the kind words about our system in Canada. I agree. We have a sense of pride. Those of us who work in the space have an enormous pride in the work we do, are deeply kind of values oriented toward supporting young people's pathways through education. And so that's exciting. And the recognition we have so much more to do. Our take-up problem is significant and serious and enshrined in legislation. Pushing through outreach is wholly, as you would say, insufficient. So this is where we look to you in our southern neighbors. And I think other things that have surfaced is what's on my mind is our need to do a better job at working with our important financial institution partners, some of whom go above and beyond to support some children in enrolling in the Canada Learning Bond. Others sometimes turn children away at the door of financial institutions. And so there is a lot of work to be done, and a lot of work to be done in a context that recognizes the different needs of some of our underserved population, those who live in rural and remote areas in Canada, our Indigenous children and their families, and those who are experiencing the lowest of the low income. So sometimes that language is called hardest to reach. And so what we can do better in those spaces is what keeps us going toward continuing to do better.
Awesome. Willie, is there anything that you would say in conclusion other than thank you to Christina?
I would say that, I think the program is going really well in Canada, and I'm excited about the data that you produced and what's to come. And I just look forward to developing our partnership more. I don't think we've done a good enough job of kind of leveraging what each other is doing to boost each other's opportunities. And I will also say quickly is that there's a lot of international work going on with children's savings accounts. There will be several, at least two more countries coming on board to countrywide or national type programs here at the beginning of the new year. And so this is something that certainly is growing internationally and something for all these programs to kind of look to Canada because look, they'll be starting from birth again, right? And so they won't have any of these outcomes for years and years. And so people are going to be looking to Canada for a good amount of time for kind of your experiences and your learning. So we really appreciate all that you're doing and in our ability to, and just being a good people.
Thank you so much.
Before we end, I got to say, please subscribe, please link, hit like, I guess. And so we can help other people get this podcast and look forward to episodes coming up with New York City and their community-based scholarships. And I think that's one aspect that Canada could build on is multiple streams of assets flowing into the accounts. And so
I had a question about that, Willie, but I didn't get to it in the 45 minutes. So yes, no. And to be fair, Canada is starting with a more robust and closer to sufficient, infusion of assets built into their policy. But there are always other streams of assets that could be leveraged to support
Canada. The most powerful part of CSAs is the ability for multiple streams. And in the US is just beginning to look at that and think about that. But I'm telling you, the government investment you already have, the multiple streams piece could take you to free college. Understand that, right? It could take you to the ability to get to free college and even assets beyond a 4-year degree. And so looking forward to that conversation. And then Michael Sheridan will be on in episode 6, since we mentioned him earlier. So thank you, everybody. And really appreciate you. We're going to end it here and hopefully you'll come back and listen to more.
Thank you, Christina.